Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Military Career of Napoleon the Great by Montgomery Gibbs. Chapter 5, Ulm and Austerlitz.
Napoleon had now reached such a point of power that the Bourbons resigned all hopes of restoration through his agency, and as the next best means of obtaining control of the throne of France, assassination was decided upon. The first consul had scarcely been in Paris a month after the engagement at Marengo, when Serachi, a sculptor of some fame, attempted Bonaparte's life as he was entering the theater. But for his betrayal by a co-conspirator, the plot would have succeeded. This attempt by means of the dagger was followed by the explosion of an infernal machine, which consisted of a barrel of gunpowder surrounded by an immense quantity of grape shot. On the night of October 10th, the machine was placed at Necais, a narrow street through which Napoleon was to pass on his way to the Opera House. Some years later, in telling of the narrow escape he had on that night, he said, "I had been hard at work all day, and was so overpowered by sleep after dinner that Josephine, who was quite anxious to go to the opera that night, found it quite difficult to arouse me and persuade me to go. I fell asleep again after we had entered the carriage, and I was dreaming of the danger I had undergone some years before in crossing the Tagliamento at midnight by the light of torches during a flood, when I was waked by the explosion of the infernal machine. We are blown up," I said to Bessières and Lannes, who were in the carriage, and then quickly commanded the coachman to drive on. The coachman, who was intoxicated, heard the order, and having mistaken the explosion for a salute, lashed his horses furiously until the theater was reached. The machine had been fired by a slow match, and the explosion took place just 20 seconds too soon. Summary justice was executed upon the perpetrators of this infamous deed, and some time later the Duc d'Enghien atoned for the part, whatever it might have been, that the Bourbons had taken in these murderous schemes. Austria delayed for several months final negotiations of the treaty agreed upon after the engagement at Marengo, evidently reassured by the attempts made on the first consul's life. Preliminaries of peace had been signed at Paris between the Austrian general St. Julien and the French government. Duroc was dispatched to the Emperor of Austria to obtain his ratification of the articles, but having reached the headquarters of the Army of the Rhine, he was refused a pass to proceed on his journey. Napoleon immediately ordered Moreau to recommence hostilities, unless the emperor delivered up the fortresses of Ulm, Ingolstadt, and Philipsburg as pledges of his sincerity. Austria, accordingly, purchased a further protraction of the armistice at this heavy price, at the same time offering to treat for peace on new grounds. News of the occupation of the three fortresses by the French troops was announced in Paris on the 23rd of September 1800, where the fresh hopes of peace caused universal satisfaction. These hopes, however, proved delusive. Austria delayed and equivocated until it became evident the emperor would make no peace separate from England, and that the latter power was prepared to support her ally. Napoleon, perceiving that he was being trifled with, now gave orders, in November 1800, to all his generals to put their divisions in march all along the frontiers of the French dominions. The shock was instantaneous, from the Rhine to the Mincio. Brune overwhelmed the Austrians on the Mincio, MacDonald held the Tyrol, and Moreau achieved the glorious victory of Hohenlinden after a desperate and most sanguinary battle. This latter contest decided the fate of the campaign. Thus, with three victorious armies, either of which could have marched triumphantly into Vienna, Napoleon hesitated long enough before taking that final step to allow Austria to sign an honest and definite peace. The Treaty of Luneville was at last signed in good faith on February 9, 1801. By the Peace of Luneville, Napoleon for the second time effected the pacification of the continent. Of all the powerful coalition which threatened France in 1800, England alone continued hostile in 1801 if we except Turkey, with which no arrangement could be made until the affairs of Egypt were settled. On the 8th of March, 1801, a British army of 17,000 men landed in Egypt under the command of Sir Ralph Abercrombie. The French were very ill prepared for an attack. the English army overcame the resistance of the forces which opposed their landing through the heavy surf formed on the beach and advanced upon their enemy. No general action occurred until the 21st, when the English obtained a decisive victory and drove Menu, who had succeeded to the command of the troops in Egypt at the death of Kleber, with great loss within the walls of Alexandria. Here he was blockaded, and General Belliard, cut off from all communication with him, capitulated, after which Menu submitted. Each capitulated on condition of being taken back to France with all his troops and their arms and baggage. Thus ended the conquest of Egypt by Napoleon. The French admiral, Ganthaume, had long been making fruitless efforts to land reinforcements in Egypt, but had been unable to elude the British ships. He was now ordered to return to Toulon, where preparations were made to receive the French troops. After the news of the reverses of the French army in Egypt and the great sea victory of Copenhagen by Nelson, Napoleon was determined to bring England to negotiations of peace and a recognition of the French Republic. And with this in view, he gathered an army of 100,000 men on the coasts of France, with a flotilla sufficiently large to effect a landing in England whenever circumstances seemed to favor such a movement. At this very moment it was that Fulton, the inventor of steamboats, communicated his discovery to the First Consul. Napoleon thus had the first chance placed in his hands of possessing exclusively for a time the greatest and most diversified means of physical power ever known in the world. Scarcely deigning to bestow a thought upon the subject, the First Consul treated the inventor as a visionary. Whether or not Napoleon ever intended to invade Great Britain, he succeeded at all events in convincing the world for a time that such was his design. And when the Peace of Amiens was signed on March 25, 1802, Paris and London rejoiced, as did all civilized nations. The Peace of Amiens left the military resources of France unemployed on the hands of Bonaparte. This induced him to think of profiting by the European calm and effect the conquest of Saint Domingo. He gave the command of the expedition to his brother-in-law, Leclerc, but it was unsuccessful. The inauguration of Christian worship once more in France in 1802 gave Napoleon an opportunity to show that he had the interest of the people at heart. France was an infidel nation, and it was the fashion to believe there was no God. The signing of the Concordat by Pope Pius VII gave to France what she had long needed, a form of religious worship. It required no little strength of purpose to take this step. Religion is a principle which cannot be eradicated from the heart of man, said Napoleon. Last Sunday I was walking here alone, and the church bells of the village of Ruel rang at sunset. I was strongly moved, so vividly did the memory of early days come back with that sound. If it be thus with me, what must it be with others? In re-establishing the church, I consult the wishes of the great majority of my people. A grand religious ceremony took place at Notre Dame Cathedral to celebrate the proclamation of the Concordat, at which the First Consul presided with great pomp, attended by all the ministers and general officers then in Paris. Another measure, adopted at this period, was the decree permitting the return of the emigrants, provided they appeared and took the oath to the government within a certain period. It is estimated that 100,000 exiles returned to their country in consequence of this decree. It was about this period, too, that the First Consul turned his attention to the system of a national education. He also commenced the Herculean task of preparing a code of law for the French nation, with the result that the Code Napoleon is known to every civilized nation of the earth. Public improvements, formerly projected, were now carried out, and sciences and the arts progressed as never before. The Order of the Legion of Honor owes its inception to Napoleon Bonaparte, and it was he who placed it on such a footing in France that it has since thrived there as has no similar institution on the continent. When established by him after months of careful consideration, he believed it necessary to France. To his counselors of state, he said, "They talk about ribbons and crosses being the playthings of monarchs, and say that the old Romans had no system of honorary rewards. The Romans had patricians, knights, citizens, and slaves, for each class different dresses and different manners, mural crowns, civic crowns, orations, triumphs, and titles. When the noble band of patricians lost its influence, Rome fell to pieces. The people were a vile rabble. It was then that you saw the fury of Marius, the prescriptions of Sylla, and afterward of the emperors. In that manner, Brutus is talked of as the enemy of tyrants. He was an aristocrat who stabbed Caesar because Caesar wished to lower the authority of the Senate. You call these ribbons and crosses child's rattles, be it so. It is with such rattles that men are led. I would not say that to the multitude, but in a council of wise men and statesmen, one may speak the truth. Observe how the people bow before the decorations of foreigners. Voltaire calls the common soldiers Alexanders at 5 sous a day. He was right. It is just so. Do you imagine you can make men fight by reasoning? Never. You must bribe them with glory, with distinctions and rewards. In fine, it is agreed that we have need of some kind of institutions. If this Legion of Honor is not approved, let some other be suggested. I do not pretend that it alone will save the state, but it will do its part. The Legion of Honor was instituted on the 15th of May, 1802. When Napoleon had seen the fruits of it, he said, "This order was the reward of every one who was an honor to his country, stood at the head of his profession, and contributed to the national prosperity and glory." Some were dissatisfied because the decoration was conferred alike on officers and soldiers, others because it was given for civil and military merits indiscriminately. But if this order ever cease to be the recompense of the brave private, or be confined to military men alone, it will cease to be what I made it, the Legion of Honor. The first consul was, in right of his office, Captain General of the Legion and President of the Council of Administration. The nomination of all the members was for life. The grand officers were endowed with a yearly pension of upwards of $1,000. Pensions, decreasing in amount, were also affixed to the subordinate degrees of rank in the order. All the members were required to swear upon their honor to defend the government of France and maintain the inviolability of her empire, to combat, by every lawful means, against the re-establishment of feudal institutions, and to concur in maintaining the principle of liberty and equality. On the day the order was instituted, Napoleon, by act of the Senate, was appointed consul for life. The first consul accepted the offered prolongation from the Senate, on the condition that the opinion of the people should be consulted on the subject. The question put to them, as framed by Cambacérès and Lebrun, was, Napoleon Bonaparte, shall he be consul for life? Registers were opened in all municipalities, and the answer of the people qualified to vote was decisive. Upwards of 3,500,000 voted for the proposal, 8,300 against it. In the month of August, Napoleon was formally declared consul for life, and a decree of the Senate immediately consolidated his power, by permitting him to appoint his successor. This personal elevation had its ample share in contributing to the number of Napoleon's enemies. In fact, it appears in some measure astonishing how any individual could persuade a whole nation, day after day, to yield him up such a portion of its rights and privileges. However, among many instances that might be adduced of his powers of persuasion, one which occurred about this period is not the least remarkable. In the beginning of the summer of 1802, some officers of rank, enthusiastic Republicans, took umbrage at Napoleon's conduct, and determined to go and remonstrate with him upon the points that had given them offense, and speak their minds freely. On the evening of the same day, one of the party gave the following account of the interview. "I do not know whence it arises, but there is a charm about that man, indescribable and irresistible. I am no admirer of his. I dislike the power to which he has risen. Yet I cannot help confessing that there is something in him which seems to speak him born to command." We went into his apartment, determined to declare our minds, to expostulate with him warmly, and not to depart till our subject of complaint should be removed. But in his manner of receiving us, there was a certain tact which disarmed us in a moment, nor could we utter one word of what we had intended to say. He talked to us for a length of time, with an eloquence peculiarly his own, explaining with the utmost clearness and precision the necessity of steadily pursuing the line of conduct he had adopted, and, without contradicting us in direct terms, controverted our opinions so ably that we had not a word to offer in reply. We therefore retired, having done nothing but listen to, instead of expostulating with him, fully convinced, at least for the moment, that he was right, and that we were altogether in the wrong. Towards the close of the year 1802, it became evident that the Peace of Amiens was based on a hollow foundation and was destined at no distant period to be overthrown. At an interview held with Lord Whitworth, an ambassador from England, Napoleon said, "No consideration on earth shall make me consent to your retention of Malta. I would as soon agree to put you in possession of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Every wind that blows from England brings nothing but hatred and hostility towards me. An invasion is the only means of offense that I can take against her, and I am determined to put myself at the head of the expedition. There are 100 chances to 1 against my success, but I am not the less determined to attempt the descent if war must be the consequence of the present discussion." He now quickly brought matters to a crisis. He attacked the ambassador in vigorous language at a diplomatic meeting at the Tuileries, which ended in an abrupt termination of the conference by Napoleon leaving the room. The armistice lasted until March 18, 1803, when England again declared war upon France. All commerce of the French nation was ordered seized, wherever found, and 200 vessels, containing at least $15 million worth of property, fell into the hands of England. Napoleon retaliated by arresting upwards of 10,000 Englishmen then in France. The tocsin of war was sounded in every part of Europe, and 160,000 French soldiers were marshaled on the coasts of France, again threatening an invasion of England. France at this time was totally unprepared for war, a proof sufficient to show that the First Consul had not desired the termination of peace. The army was completely on a peace establishment. Great numbers of the troops were disbanded, and the parks of artillery were broken up. New plans for recasting the artillery had been proposed, and they had already begun to break up the cannon to throw them into the furnaces. The navy was in a still less serviceable condition. In an address to the Senate, Napoleon said, "The negotiations are ended, and we are attacked. Let us at least fight to maintain the faith of treaties and the honor of the French name." The nation responded with enthusiasm to the call. Sums of money were voted by the large towns for building ships, and the army was rapidly recruited. The first hostile movement of Napoleon was upon the continental domains of George III. General Mortier invaded the electorate of Hanover with 15,000 men, and the Hanoverian army laid down its arms. The second movement of the First Consul was the occupation of Naples. No resistance was attempted. These measures, besides enabling Napoleon to maintain his army by levies on the foreign states he occupied, also crippled the commerce of England by shutting up all communication with many of the best markets on the continent. The First Consul now visited the principal towns, accompanied by Josephine, where he made observations and gave orders respecting the fortifications. These measures were all preparatory on the part of Napoleon to his determined plan to attempt the invasion of England. Funds were secured in part by the sale of Louisiana to the United States. Assassination was now again resorted to that Napoleon might be overthrown, but every attempt, as heretofore, proved futile. Conspiracy after conspiracy was detected, all traced to Napoleon's political enemies. The First Consul resolved on retaliation and ordered the arrest of the Duke d'Enghien at his castle in the Duchy of Baden. 3 days afterwards, the Duke was conveyed to Paris, and after a few hours' imprisonment, was taken to the old state prison of France, where he was tried by court-martial, and in a most summary and hasty manner pronounced guilty of having fought against the Republic and condemned to death. He was led down a winding stairway by torchlight and shot in a ditch in the castle at 6 o'clock in the morning. All Europe shuddered at the deed, but it produced exactly the result Napoleon intended by it. He was safe from attempts on his life forever afterwards. Before the discovery of this plot, the French Senate had sent an address to Napoleon congratulating him on his escape from a former conspiracy in which 100 persons had schemed to take his life. In answer, he said, "I have long since renounced the hope of enjoying the pleasures of a private life. All my days are employed in fulfilling the duties which my fate and the will of the French people have imposed upon me. Heaven will watch over France and defeat the plots of the wicked. The citizens may be without alarm. My life will last as long as it will be useful to the nation. But I wish the French people to understand that existence without their confidence and affection would be to me without consolation, and would for them have no object. The title of First Consul, by which Napoleon had been distinguished for more than 4 years, was exchanged on the 18th of May, 1804, for that of Emperor by the advice of the Senate, where it was first publicly broached, and by the universal assent of the French nation. Upwards of 3.5 million voted for the measure, and about 2,000 against it. The debates in the Senate were somewhat protracted, and so great was the impatience of the military that the garrison of Paris had resolved to proclaim their chief as emperor at the first review, and Murat, governor of the city, was obliged to assemble the officers at his house and bind them by a promise to restrain the troops. The spirit of the army at Boulogne was soon manifested by their voting the erection of a colossal statue of Napoleon in bronze to be placed in the midst of the camp. Every soldier subscribed a portion of his pay for the purpose, but there was a want of bronze. Soult, who presided over the completion of the undertaking, went at the head of a deputation to Napoleon and said, "Sire, lend me the bronze, and I will repay it in enemy's cannon at the first battle." And he kept his word. On the 27th of May, Napoleon received the oath of the Senate, the constituted bodies, the learned corporations, and the troops of the garrison of Paris. Louis XVIII immediately addressed a protest to all the sovereigns of Europe against the usurpation of Napoleon. Fouché, who was the first who heard of this document, immediately communicated the intelligence to the emperor with a view to prepare the necessary orders to watch over those who might attempt its circulation. But great was his surprise on receiving directions to have the whole inserted in the Moniteur the following morning, where it actually appeared. This was all the notice taken of the matter by Napoleon. On December 1st of the same year, the lists of votes in favor of the establishment of the hereditary succession of the empire in his family were publicly presented by the Senate to Napoleon. And on the following day, in the midst of one of the most imposing and brilliant scenes ever enacted in France, Napoleon and Josephine were crowned Emperor and Empress of France by Pius VII, the Pontiff of Rome, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The emperor took his coronation oath as usual on such occasions, with his hand upon the scripture, and in the form repeated to him by the Pope. But in the act of coronation itself there was a marked deviation from the universal custom. The crown, having been blessed by the Pope, Napoleon took it from the altar with his own hands and placed it on his brow. He then put the diadem on the head of Josephine. The heralds proclaimed that the thrice glorious and thrice august Napoleon, Emperor of the French, was crowned and installed, and so ended the pageant. Those who remember having beheld it, says Sir Walter Scott, must now doubt whether they were waking or whether fancy had formed a vision so dazzling in its appearance, so extraordinary in its origin and progress, and so ephemeral in its endurance. The senators of the Italian Republic soon afterwards requested that Napoleon be crowned as their king, and on the following May 1805, in the ancient cathedral of Milan, he assumed the iron crown of the Lombard kings, saying as he did so, "God has given it to me. Let him beware who would touch it." The new order of knighthood, that of the Iron Crown, with these words for its motto, arose out of this ceremony. On the 8th of May, while on the road to Milan, Napoleon expressed a wish to visit the battlefield of Marengo, on which he had reconquered Italy 5 years before. All the French troops in that part of Italy were therefore mustered there, to the number of 30,000. Covered with the hat and uniform which he wore on the day of that memorable conflict, the emperor passed the army in review on horseback and distributed crosses of the Legion of Honor, with the same ceremonies which had been observed on the Champ de Mars and the same return of enthusiastic devotion on the parts of the troops. It was remarked, says Bourrienne, that the worms, who spare neither the costumes of living kings nor the bodies of deceased heroes, had been busy with the trophies of Marengo, which, nevertheless, Bonaparte wore at the review. Napoleon did not continue his journey until after he had laid the first stone of the monument consecrated to those who had been slain on the battlefield, and on the same day he made his entry into Milan. Meanwhile, the activity in France continued unabated, and scarcely a day passed without some trifling engagement, brought on by the rigorous pursuit of the squadrons of the French fleet as they advanced to Boulogne. Scarcely had the emperor entered Paris after his return from the coronation in Italy before he learned that a new coalition had been formed against him, and that England, Russia, Austria, and Sweden, with 500,000 men, were preparing once more for war. The objects proposed were, briefly, the independence of Holland and Switzerland, the evacuation of Hanover, and the north of Germany by the French troops, the restoration of Piedmont to the King of Sardinia, and the complete evacuation of Italy by France. Great Britain, besides affording the assistance of her forces by sea and land, was to pay large subsidies for supporting the armies of the coalition. Napoleon had, in a great degree, penetrated the schemes of the Allied powers, but was not prepared for the sudden assumption of arms by Austria without any declaration of war, a measure which Austria justified by referring to the increasing encroachments of France in Italy. As the emperor desired leisure to prosecute and perfect the great public works he had begun or projected, he most earnestly wished for peace, and he again addressed a letter to the King of England, and which was treated with contempt. An envoy was sent to Frankfurt on the Main to ascertain definitely whether Austria really intended to trample another treaty in the dirt, and so soon after the fatal day at Marengo. The messenger soon returned with the best maps of the German Empire, and opening them on the council table of the Tuileries, said, "The Austrian general is advancing on Munich. The Russian army is in motion, and Prussia will join them." The Emperor of Russia had pushed on to Berlin to win over the Prussian monarch to the great Bourbon coalition, and to make the compact more impressive, he asked his royal brother to visit with him the tomb of Frederick the Great. They descended by torchlight to the vault, and there, over the honored dust of Frederick, Francis, his heir, took a solemn oath, as he pointed to the sword of his ancestor as it lay on the coffin, to join the European coalition. Some weeks afterwards, Napoleon visited the tomb as a conqueror, and said to his attendant as he seized the precious relics, "These orders and swords shall witness no other such scene of perjury over the ashes of Frederick." The young Emperor of France now gathered his eagles to lead them toward the Danube. To the French Senate, whom Napoleon informed of the hostile conduct of Russia and Austria, the emperor said, "I am about to quit my capital to place myself at the head of my army in order that I may render prompt assistance to my allies and defend the dearest interests of my people. I groan for the blood which it will cost Europe, but it will be the means of adding new luster to the French name." Another campaign against the kings of Europe was inevitable, and he proceeded to achieve the destruction of Mac's army, not as at Marengo by one general battle, but by a series of grand maneuvers and a train of partial actions necessary to execute them, which rendered assistance and retreat alike impossible. The great army that had been assembled on the coast of France to invade England was now relieved from its inactivity and directed to march upon the German frontiers. The Count de Ségur, who had command of the detachment of the Guard at the Tuileries and accompanied Napoleon on this campaign, relates in his Memoirs a remarkable scene in the emperor's private quarters at Boulogne before Napoleon started for the frontier. The emperor had just received news that Admiral Villeneuve had taken the French fleet to Ferrol and left the Channel. On learning this, the emperor at once decided that the contemplated invasion of England was then impossible. Ségur then says, "Sit there," Napoleon said to Monsieur Deroux, then acting as intendant general of the army, "and write." And then, without a transition, without any apparent meditation, with his brief and imperious accent, he dictated to him, without hesitation, the plan of the campaign of Ulm as far as Vienna. The army of the coast, fronting the ocean for more than 200 leagues, was at the first signal to turn round and march on the Danube in several columns. The order of the marches, their duration, points of concentration, of reunion of the columns, surprises, attacks, various movements, the enemy's mistakes, all was foreseen. the battlefields, the victories, even the dates on which we were to enter Munich and Vienna, all was then written just as it happened, and this 2 months in advance, at this very hour of the 13th of August, and from this quarter-general on the coast. Daru, however, accustomed to the inspirations of his chief, remained dumbfounded, and he was even more surprised when afterwards he saw these oracles realized. The emperor returned to Paris without delay, and there laid before the Senate the state of the army and announced the commencement of hostilities. It was 5 years since the soldiers had been in battle, and for 2.5 years they had been waiting in vain for an opportunity to cross over into England. It would be difficult to form any conception then of their joy or of their ardor when they learned they were going to be employed in a great war. Old and young ardently longed for battles, dangers, distant expeditions. They had conquered the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians. They despised all the soldiers of Europe and did not imagine there was an army in the world capable of resisting them. They set off singing and shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" At the same time, Massena received orders to assume the offensive in Italy and force his way, if possible, into the hereditary states of Austria. The two French armies, one crossing the Rhine and the other pushing through the Tyrolese, looked forward to a junction before the walls of Vienna. After appointing Joseph Bonaparte to superintend the government in his absence, Napoleon quitted Paris on the 24th of September 1805, accompanied as far as Strasbourg by Josephine. Here they separated. The emperor put himself at the head of his army and crossed the Rhine on the 1st of October. He now begun a series of grand maneuvers and partial actions, requiring consummate skill, with a view to the destruction of the great Austrian army under General Mack. Mack, at the head of the Austrian forces, established his headquarters on the western frontier of Bavaria, at Ulm. Prudence would have suggested that he occupy the line of the river Inn, which, extending from the Tyrol to the Danube at Passau, affords a strong defense to the Austrian territory, and on which he might have awaited, in comparative safety, the arrival of the Russian forces, then on the march to aid Austria in the campaign. Napoleon hastened to profit by Mack's error, and by a combination of maneuvers with his different divisions, the great body of the French army advanced into the heart of Germany by the left of the Danube, and then throwing himself across the river, took ground in the Austrian general's rear when he expected to be assaulted in front of Ulm. As it was, Mack's communication with Vienna was interrupted, and he was completely isolated. Never was astonishment equal to that which filled all Europe on the unexpected arrival of the French army. It was supposed to be on the shores of the ocean, and in 20 days, scarcely time enough for the report of its march to spread to this point, it appeared on the Rhine. Napoleon did not effect his purpose of taking up a position in the rear of Mack without resistance, but in the various engagements with the different divisions of the Austrian army at Wertingen, Günzburg, Memmingen, and Elchingen, the French were uniformly successful. At Memmingen, General Spangenberg was forced to capitulate, and 5,000 men laid down their arms. Not less than 20,000 prisoners fell into the hands of the French between the 26th of September and the 13th of October. The emperor passed in review the dragoons of the village of Zummershausen, when he ordered to be brought before him a dragoon named Marente, of the 4th Regiment, one of the gallant soldiers who, at the passage of the Lech, had saved his captain, by whom he had, a few days before, been cashiered from his rank. Napoleon then bestowed upon him the Eagle of the Legion of Honor. "I have only done my duty," observed the soldier. "My captain degraded me on account of some violation of discipline, but he knows I have always proved a good soldier." The emperor expressed his satisfaction to the dragoons for the bravery they had displayed at the Battle of Wertingen, and ordered each regiment to present a dragoon, on whom he also bestowed the decoration of the Legion of Honor. Napoleon looked upon the Battle of Elchingen, which followed the actions at Wertingen and Günzburg, as one of the finest feats of arms that his army had ever accomplished. From this field of battle he sent the Senate 40 standards taken by the French army in the various battles which had succeeded that of Wertingen. "Since my entry on this campaign," he wrote, "I have disposed of an army of 100,000 men. I have taken nearly half of them prisoners. The rest have either deserted, are killed, wounded, or reduced to the greatest consternation. Assisted by divine providence, I hope in a short time to triumph over all my enemies." By the 13th of October, General Mack found himself completely surrounded at Ulm, with a garrison of fully 20,000 good troops. On this day, Napoleon made an exciting address to his soldiers on the bridge of the Lech amid the most intense cold, the ground being covered with snow and the troops sunk to the knees in mud. He warned them to expect a great battle and explained the desperate condition of the enemy. He was answered with acclamations and repeated shouts of "Vive l'Empereur!" In listening to his exciting words, the soldiers forgot their fatigues and privations and were impatient to rush into the fight. As Napoleon passed through a crowd of prisoners, an Austrian colonel expressed his astonishment on beholding the Emperor of the French drenched with rain, covered with dirt, and as much or even more fatigued than the meanest drummer in his army. An aide-de-camp present having explained to him what the Austrian officer said, the emperor ordered this answer to be given: "Your master wished me to recollect that I was a soldier. I hope that he will allow that the throne and the imperial purple have not made me forget my original profession." From the height of the Abbey of Elchingen, Napoleon now beheld the city of Ulm at his feet, commanded on every side by his cannon, his victorious troops ready for the assault, and the great Austrian army cooped up within the walls. 4 days later, a flag of truce came from General Mack. Napoleon had called upon the commander to surrender, and unlike the brave Wurmser, who held Mantua to extremity during the campaign of Alvinzi, he capitulated without hazarding a blow. On the previous day, Mack had published a proclamation urging his troops to prepare for the utmost pertinacity of defense, and forbidding, on the pain of death, the very word surrender to be breathed within the walls of Ulm. He announced the arrival of 2 powerful armies, one of Austrians, the other of Russians, whose appearance would presently raise the blockade. He even declared his intention of eating horseflesh rather than listen to any terms of capitulation. On the morning of October 15th, Napoleon finally resolved to bring the affair to a close and gave orders to Marshal Ney to storm the heights of Michaelsburg. All at once, a battery unmasked by the Austrians poured its grape shot upon the imperial group. Lannes, who was to flank Ney, abruptly seized Napoleon's horse to lead him out of the galling fire. The latter had taken up a position to watch Ney, who had set his columns in motion. Changing to a safe position, the emperor saw this intrepid leader climb the entrenchments raised on Michaelsburg and carry them with the bayonet. Lannes secured another point of attack a moment later. Napoleon then suspended the combat until the next day, when he ordered a few shells to be thrown into Ulm, and in the evening sent Ségur to General Mack summoning him to surrender. The envoy had great difficulty in getting into the place. He was led blindfold before Mack, who, striving to conceal his anxiety, was nevertheless unable to dissemble his surprise and grief on learning the extent of his disaster and hopeless position. On the 17th, Mack signed articles by which hostilities were immediately ceased, and he, with all his men, agreed to surrender themselves as prisoners of war within 10 days, unless some Austrian or Russian force should appear and attempt to raise the blockade. On the 19th, after a personal visit to Napoleon's camp, Mack submitted to a revision of the treaty, and on the 20th, a formal evacuation of Ulm took place. 36,000 soldiers filed off and laid down their arms before Napoleon and his staff. A large watchfire had been made, near which the emperor posted himself to witness the ceremony. General Mack came forward and delivered his sword, exclaiming with grief, "Here is the unfortunate Mack!" Napoleon received him and his officers with the greatest courtesy. 18 generals were dismissed on parole. An immense quantity of ammunition of all sorts fell into the hands of the victor, and a wagonful of Austrian standards was sent to Paris. Napoleon enforced the strictest silence on his troops, while this ceremony, so painful to their enemies, continued. In one instance, he instantly ordered out of his presence one of his own generals, from whom his quick ear caught some witticism passed on the occasion. All the Austrian officers were allowed to return home. On giving their word of honor, not to serve against France until a general exchange of prisoners should take place. This campaign is perhaps unexampled in the history of warfare for the greatness of its results, in comparison with the smallness of the expense at which they were obtained. Of the French army, scarcely 1,500 men were killed and wounded, while the Austrian army of almost 90,000 men was nearly annihilated, all with the exception of 15,000 who escaped, being killed, wounded, or prisoners, and having lost also 200 pieces of cannon and 90 flags. It was a common remark among the troops, "The emperor has found a new method of carrying on war. He makes us use our legs instead of our bayonets." 5/6 of the French army never fired a shot, at which the troops were much mortified. Massena was also successful in his advance from Lombardy, the Archduke Charles, who commanded an army of 80,000 men for Austria, being forced to abandon Italy, and Marshal Ney, whom Napoleon had detached from his own main army with orders to advance in the Tyrol, was no less successful. The number of prisoners taken in this campaign was so great that Napoleon distributed them amongst the agriculturists, that their work in the fields might make up for the absence of the conscripts, whom he had withdrawn from such labor. Rumors of the approach of the Russians, headed by the Emperor Alexander in person, came fast and frequent. The divisions of Massena and Ney were now at the disposal of Napoleon, who was concentrating his forces for the purpose of attacking Vienna, and with the main body now moved on the capital of the Austrian emperor. The Emperor Francis, perceiving that Vienna was incapable of defense, quitted his palace on the 7th of November and proceeded to the headquarters of Alexander at Brunn. While Napoleon was riding on horseback on the Vienna road, he perceived an open carriage approaching, in which were seated a priest and a lady bathed in tears. The emperor was dressed, as usual, in the uniform of a colonel of the Chasseurs of the Guard. The lady did not recognize him. He inquired the cause of her distress and where she was going. "Sir," said she, "I have been robbed about 2 leagues hence by a party of soldiers who have killed my gardener. I am going to request that your emperor will grant me a guard. He once knew my family well and lay under obligations to them." "Your name?" inquired Napoleon. "De Bruni," answered the lady. "I am the daughter of Monsieur de Marbeuf, formerly governor of Corsica." "I am delighted to meet with you, madame," exclaimed Napoleon with the most charming frankness, "and to have an opportunity of serving you. I am the emperor." The lady expressed much surprise and passed on, agreeing to wait for the commander at headquarters. Here she was furnished a piquet of chasseurs. On the 13th the French entered Vienna, and Napoleon took up his residence in the imperial palace of Schönbrunn, the home of the Austrian Caesars. While at this point Napoleon learned of the success of the English at Trafalgar on October 19th, the day after Max surrendered at Ulm. It was a battle sternly contested and resulted in the final annihilation of the French fleet. Great as the triumph was for England, it was dearly purchased, for Nelson fell, mortally wounded, early in the action. He lived just long enough to hear the cheers of victory, and as he passed away said, "Thank God, I have done my duty." The tidings of Trafalgar served but as a new stimulus to Napoleon's energy. "Heaven has given the empire of the sea to England," he said, "but to us has fate decreed the dominion of the land." But though such signal success had crowned the commencement of the campaign, it was necessary to defeat the haughty Russians before the object of the war could be considered as attained. The broken and shattered remnant of the Austrian forces had rallied from different quarters around the yet untouched army of Alexander. Napoleon had therefore waited until the result of his skillful combinations had drawn around him the greatest force he could expect to collect ere venturing upon a general battle. He then quitted Vienna and put himself at the head of his columns, which soon found themselves within reach of the Russian and Austrian forces, at length combined and ready for action and under the eye of their emperors. Now it was to be a battle of 3 emperors, France, Russia, and Austria. Napoleon fixed his headquarters at Brunn, where he arrived on the 20th of November, and riding over the plain between this point and Austerlitz, a village about 2 miles from Brunn, said to his generals, "Study this field well. We shall ere long have to contest it. Napoleon, on learning that the Emperor Alexander was personally in the hostile camp, sent Savary to present his compliments to that sovereign, and of course, incidentally, to observe as much as he could of the numbers and condition of the enemy's troops. The messenger reported that the Russians labored under a belief that the reverses of the previous campaign were the result of unpardonable cowardice among the Austrians, and the first general battle would show the sort of warriors the Russians were. Savary said that from the conversations he had for 3 days with nearly 30 coxcombs about the person of Alexander, that presumption, inconsiderateness, and imprudence reigned in the decisions of the military as much as in the political cabinet, and that an army so conducted must of necessity commit great faults. The Czar sent a young aide-de-camp to return the compliment carried by Savary, and he found the French soldiery engaged in fortifying their position, a position which Napoleon had some time before determined to occupy. But the negotiations were of no avail. Napoleon wanted either an overwhelming battle or peace. The aide-de-camp sent by Alexander was impressed with what appeared to him to be evidence of fear and apprehension on the part of the French. The placing of strong guards and fortifications thrown up with such haste appeared to him like the precautions of an army half beaten. The Russian prince discussed every point with an air of impertinence difficult to be conceived. He spoke to Napoleon as if he had been conversing with a Russian officer, but the emperor repressed his indignation, and the young man returned under a full conviction that the French army was on the brink of ruin. Several old Austrian generals who had made campaigns against Napoleon are said to have warned the Russian council against too much confidence, as they were to march against old soldiers and able officers. They said they had seen Napoleon, when reduced to a handful of men, repossess himself of victory, under the most difficult circumstances, by rapid and unforeseen operations, in which manner he had destroyed numerous armies. The presumptuous young man declared that the presence of the Russian emperor would inspire the troops to victory, especially as they would be aided by the picked troops of the Imperial Guard of Russia. On the 1st of December, on seeing the Russians begin to descend from a chain of heights on which they might have received an attack with great advantage to themselves, and have remained in safety until the Archduke Charles could come up with the 80,000 men in Bohemia and Hungary, Napoleon exclaimed rapturously as he witnessed the rash maneuver, "In 24 hours that army will be mine." In the meantime, withdrawing his outposts and concentrating his forces, he continued to imitate a conscious inferiority which was far from existing. In the order of the day, December 1, before the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon inserted the following proclamation: "Soldiers, the Russians are before you, to avenge the Austrian army at Ulm. They consist of the same battalions you beat at Hohenbrunn and have constantly pursued. The positions we occupy are formidable, and, while they march to my right, they shall present me their flank. Soldiers, I will direct myself all your battalions. I shall keep at a distance from the firing, if, with your accustomed bravery, you carry confusion and disorder into the enemy's ranks. But, should victory appear for a moment doubtful, you shall see your emperor expose himself to the first blows. For victory cannot hesitate on this day, in which the honor of the French infantry, of so much importance to the whole army, is concerned. Suffer not the ranks to be thinned, under pretense of carrying off the wounded, but let each man be well persuaded that we must conquer the hirelings of England, who are animated with so deep a hatred of our nation. This victory must terminate our campaign, when we shall resume our winter quarters and be joined by the new armies forming in France. The peace which I make will be worthy of my people, of you, and myself." Signed, Napoleon. At 1 o'clock on the morning of the 2nd of December, Napoleon, having slept for an hour by a watchfire, got on horseback and proceeded to reconnoiter the front of his position. He wished to do so without being recognized, but the soldiers penetrated the secret, and lighting great fires of straw along the line, 80,000 men received him from post to post with great enthusiasm. They reminded him that it was the anniversary of his coronation, and declared that they would celebrate the day in a manner worthy of his glory. "Only promise us," cried one old grenadier, "that you will keep yourself out of the fire. I promise you, in the name of the grenadiers of the army, that you will have to fight only with your eyes, and we will bring you the flags and artillery of the Russian army to celebrate the anniversary of your coronation." "I will do so," answered the emperor, "but I shall be with the reserve until you need us." This promise Napoleon soon repeated in his proclamation. As he threw down his pen after signing this document, he exclaimed, "This is the noblest evening of my life, but I shall lose too many of these brave fellows tomorrow. The anguish which I experience at this idea makes me feel they are really my children, and truly I am vexed with myself for these sensations, as I fear they will unman me on the field of battle." In his preparations for this decisive contest, which he made immediately, 10 battalions of the Imperial Guard, with 10 of Oudenot's division, were to be kept in reserve in the rear of the line, under the eyes of Napoleon himself, who destined them, with 40 field pieces, to act wherever the fate of battle should render their services most necessary. The battle was planned by Napoleon in every detail, says Segur, just as he had planned the strategic movements of the army. In the early morning, he sent for all his aides-de-camp to come to the small house where he had spent the night. "We had a slight repast, which, like himself, we ate standing, after which, putting on his sword, he said, 'Now, gentlemen, let us go and begin a great day.' We all ran to our horses. A moment afterwards, we saw, on the top of the hill, which the soldiers called the Emperor's Hill, arriving from the various points of our line, followed each by their aides-de-camp, all the chiefs of our army corps, Murat, Lannes, Bernadotte, Soult, Davoust, all coming to receive final orders. If I were to live as long as the world shall last, I would never forget that scene." After a hazy, misty daybreak, the sun at last arose with uncommon brilliancy, so bright in fact that the son of Austerlitz afterwards fell into a proverb with the French soldiery, who hailed similar dawns with exultation and as a sure omen of victory. The emperor said, as he passed in front of several regiments, "Soldiers, we must finish this campaign by a thunderbolt, which shall confound the pride of our enemies." Immediately they raised their hats on the bayonets' points, and cries of "Live the Emperor" formed the actual signal for battle. A moment afterwards, the horizon cleared up, and as the sun darted forth its glistening rays, the cannonading was heard at the extremity of the right line. The great Battle of Austerlitz had begun. At the opening of the engagement, Kutuzov, the Russian general-in-chief, fell into a snare laid for him by Napoleon and sent a large division of his army to turn the right of the French. His troops, detached for this purpose, met with unexpected resistance from Davoust and were held in check. Napoleon at once seized the opportunity given him by the enemy in leaving a deep gap in their line, and upon that space Soult forthwith poured a force which entirely cut off all communication between the Russian center and left. The Tsar quickly perceived the fatal consequences of the movement and ordered his guards to rush to the eminence called the Hill of Pratzen, where the encounter was taking place, and beat back Soult. The Russians succeeded in driving the French before them, when Napoleon ordered Bessieres to their rescue with the Imperial Guards. The Russians had become somewhat disordered from the impatience of their temporary victory, and although they resisted Bessieres sternly, they were finally broken and fled. The regiment of the Grand Duke Constantine, who gallantly led the Russians, was now annihilated, and the Duke only escaped by the fleetness of his horse. The French center now advanced, and the charges of Murat's cavalry were most decisive, while the left wing, under the command of Lannes, marched forward en echelons, by regiments, in the same manner as if they had been exercising by divisions. A tremendous cannonade then took place along the whole line, 203 pieces of cannon and nearly 200,000 men being engaged, so that it was indeed a giant combat. Success could not be doubtful. In a moment the Russians were all but routed, their colonel, artillery, standards, and everything being already captured. At 1 o'clock the victory was decided. It had never been doubtful for a moment, and not a man of the reserves was required. From the heights of Austerlitz, the emperors of Russia and Austria beheld the total ruin of their center, as they had already of their left. The right wing only remained unbroken, it having contested well the impetuous charge of Lannes, but Napoleon could now gather round them on all sides, and his artillery plunging incessant fire on them from the heights, they at length found it impossible to hold their ground and were driven from position to position. They were at last forced down into a hollow where some frozen lakes offered them the only means of escape from the closing cannonade. As they did so, the French broke the ice about them by a storm of shot from 200 heavy cannon, and nearly 2,000 men died on the spot, some swept away by artillery, but the greater part being drowned beneath the broken ice. The cries of the dying Russians, as they sank beneath the waters, were drowned, however, by the victorious shouts of the French, who were pursuing the scattering remnants of the enemy in every direction. In the bulletin of the engagement, Napoleon compared the scene to that at Aboukir, when the sea was covered with turbans. The emperor had addressed his soldiers on the evening preceding the battle to heighten their courage and presage to them the victory. He did not forget to address himself to them again after the fight and felicitate them upon having so nobly contributed to verify his prediction. "Soldiers," he said to them, "you have on this day of Austerlitz justified all that which I expected from your intrepidity. You have decorated your eagles with immortal glory. When all that is necessary to assure the happiness and prosperity of our country is accomplished, I will lead you back to France. There you will be the objects of my tenderest solicitude. My people will joyously greet you again, and it will suffice for you to say, 'I was at the Battle of Austerlitz,' and for them to reply, 'Behold a brave man.'" In later years, Napoleon said of this engagement, "I have fought 30 battles like that, but I have never seen so decisive a victory, or one where the chances were so unevenly balanced." At another time, while at St. Helena, he said, "If I had not conquered at Austerlitz, I should have had all Prussia on me." It was with great difficulty that the emperors of Russia and Austria rallied some fragments of their armies around them, and terror-stricken, effected their retreat. With the conqueror there remained 20,000 prisoners, 40 pieces of artillery, and all the standards of the Imperial Guard of Russia. Such was the Battle of Austerlitz, or as the French soldiers delighted to call it, the Battle of the Emperors. And thus did Napoleon's army fulfill its pledge to celebrate the anniversary of his coronation. The fleeing emperors halted at midnight for council and decided to send a messenger to Napoleon at daylight with proposals for peace. The envoy was courteously received, and arrangements were at once made for a meeting of the Austrian and French emperors at 10 o'clock the next day. They met about 3 leagues from Austerlitz, near a mill. Napoleon was the first to arrive on the ground. He at once ordered that 2 fires be made, and with a squadron of his guard drawn up at a distance of about 200 paces, awaited the arrival of Francis and his personal suite. When Francis came in sight, accompanied by several princes and generals, and an escort of Hungarian cavalry, Napoleon advanced to his carriage and embraced him. The 2 emperors, each with an attendant, then went to one of the fires near the entrance to a military hut, while the suites of the 2 sovereigns drew around the other fire, a few paces distant. "Such are the palaces you have compelled me to occupy for these 3 months," said Napoleon, pointing to his modest quarters. "You have made such good use of them," answered Francis, "that you ought not to complain of their accommodation." The defeated emperor is represented as having thrown the blame of the war upon the English. "They are a set of merchants," he said, "who would set the continent on fire in order to secure themselves the commerce of the world." When the 2 great leaders separated, after an interview lasting an hour, they again embraced, Napoleon saying in the hearing of the gentlemen of the suites, Prince John of Liechtenstein, near Francis, and Marshal Berthier, near Napoleon, "I agree to it, but your Majesty must not make war upon me again." "No, I promise you I will not," said Francis in reply. "I will keep my word," a promise that was soon violated. It was understood that the Emperor of Russia, although not present, was to abide by the agreement for an armistice. Alexander so assured Marshal Davoust, who had pursued him the night of the battle, and the Russians were allowed by Napoleon to retire unmolested to their own territory, on the royal word of Francis that Russia would adhere to his ally of Austria. "The Russian army is surrounded," said Napoleon to Francis. "Not a man can escape me, but I wish to oblige their emperor, and will stop the march of my columns if your majesty promises me that these Russians shall evacuate Germany and the Austrian and Prussian parts of Poland." "It is the purpose of the Emperor Alexander to do so," was the reply. No other engagement was required of the Tsar than his word. When the negotiations had been completed and the Emperor Francis had departed, Napoleon walked hurriedly to and fro for a short time, and after a deep silence he was heard to say, "I have acted very unwisely. I could have followed up my victory and taken up the whole of the Austrian and Russian armies. They are both entirely in my power. But let it be. It will at least cause some less tears to be shed." Napoleon then went over the field of battle, ordering the wounded to be removed, when some of those unfortunates, forgetting their sufferings, asked, "Is the victory quite certain?" The foot guards of the emperor, not having been permitted to engage, actually wept and insisted upon doing something to identify them with the victory. "Be satisfied," said Napoleon. "You are the reserve. It will be better if you have nothing to do today." The commander of the artillery of the Imperial Russian Guard, having lost his cannon, met the French emperor and said, "Sire, order me to be shot. I have lost my cannon." "Young man," replied Napoleon, "I esteem your grief, but one may be beaten by my army and still retain some pretension to glory." The brief campaign was followed by a treaty with the Emperor of Austria, signed December 15, 1805, and another with Prussia, signed December 26 at Vienna. The victor of Austerlitz made his own terms in the negotiations. Austria gave up the last of her Italian usurpations to be annexed to the Kingdom of Italy and the Tyrol to Bavaria, and yielded other stipulations which the conqueror demanded, but which were so moderate that they excited the wonder and admiration of all Europe. Previous to Napoleon's departure for Schönbrunn on the 27th of December, he issued the following proclamation to his army. "Soldiers, peace between myself and the Emperor of Austria is signed. You have, in this late season of the year, made 2 campaigns. You have performed everything I expected. I am setting out for my capital. I have promoted and distributed rewards to those who have most distinguished themselves. I will perform everything I have promised. You have seen that your emperor has shared all your dangers and fatigues. You shall likewise behold him surrounded by all that grandeur and splendor which become the sovereign of the first nation in the world. In the beginning of the month of May, I will give a grand festival in Paris. You shall all be there. We will celebrate the memory of those who in these campaigns have fallen on the field of honor. The world shall see that we are ready to follow their example, and, if necessary, do more than we have done, against those who suffer themselves to be misled by the gold of the eternal enemy of the continent." The news of the success of the army was received with the greatest enthusiasm by the majority of the French people. Madame de Rémusat, in writing to her husband from Paris after the receipt of the news of the Battle of Austerlitz, said, "You cannot imagine how excited everyone is. Praise of the emperor is on everyone's lips. The most recalcitrant are obliged to lay down their arms and to say with the Emperor of Russia, 'He is a man of destiny.'" The campaign had consolidated the empire of Napoleon, and when he returned to France, he was received with exultation by the citizens, who tendered him fete after fete, such as had not been witnessed at the capital for years. This was followed by the elevation of many of his kinsmen and heroes to thrones of pomp and power. Coronation following coronation in rapid succession, princedoms and dukedoms being accompanied with grants of extensive estates in the countries which the French armies had conquered. From that moment, the fanaticism of military glory quite effaced the few remaining impressions made by the love of liberty.
This concludes today's reading of the military career of Napoleon the Great by Montgomery Gibbs. Join us also next week for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.